So what is culture? The Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition says that culture is the shared pattern of behaviors and interactions, cognitive constructs, and effective understanding that are learned through a process of socialization. These shared patterns identify the members of a culture group while also distinguishing those of another group. Many times when we're trying to teach children about a variety of cultures, we focus on those visible aspects of culture. We think about the food, the dress. We may have an exhibit where children have different booths and talk about the music, the dance, the dress, and the food of a particular region of our world. And no doubt, these visible pieces of culture are an important part of culture. They're to be celebrated and they're to be honored, and it's fun to take this sort of tourist approach to different regions of our world. But I want us to go deeper. I want us to think about the other aspects of culture, some of those aspects of culture that help us to be effective communicators and problem solvers with people from a variety of cultures. These pieces of culture include time, how we regard time, emotion, how we regard status, the importance of the individual versus the group, high context and low context behaviors, and internal versus external locus of control. These are all important dimensions of culture for us to understand so that we can interact effectively with many people. Before we move into these dimensions of culture, I'd like for us to consider stereotyping. We've all heard of stereotyping, but what is it exactly that makes stereotyping different from an understanding of a group's culture? Well, generalizations about a culture can help us as we prepare to interact with people from that culture. It gives us an idea of what we may expect and keep some of these nuances on our radar as we prepare to be effective communicators with that person. But the moment that we say, all people of this group X, we've stereotyped. Similarly, the moment that we say, this person must be like this because this person is a member of that group, we've stereotyped that person. I'll give you an example of how generalizations about a culture and stereotyping might differ here in Kentucky. If you lived here in Kentucky and you were planning to serve a family who lived in Appalachian Kentucky, it would be important for you to know some about Appalachian culture. Within the Appalachian culture, there tends to be more of a reliance within on family members and friends within the community and a hesitation to lean on expertise or service outside of the community. There also is a high incidence of poverty, a high incidence of disability, and lower education level in Appalachian Kentucky. As you prepare to serve a family in Appalachian Kentucky, it would be important to have an understanding of those accurate generalizations about the area. However, the moment that I assume that a person fits all of those characteristics, I've now stereotyped that person, and that's not helpful. Instead, I need to approach people that I serve with flexibility and with keen observation and looking for signals from that person about that person's culture, that family's culture, which may or may not be the same as the culture of the region or other group to which this family belongs. Next, I'd like for us to think about the term ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism looks like the word egocentrism, and it has a similar meaning. Egocentric means that a person believes that his or her point of view is the one that everyone should see, and that his or her point of view is the most important. Ethnocentrism is much the same. It involves judging another culture by the values and standards of one's own culture, especially with regard to language, customs, and religion. I'd like to show you an example of ethnocentrism that appeared in a recent governor's race.
I'm Tim James. Why do our politicians make us give driver's license exams in 12 languages? This is Alabama. We speak English. If you want to live here, learn it. We're only giving that test in English if I'm governor. Maybe it's the businessman in me, but we'll save money. And it makes sense. Does it to you?
Not all ethnocentrism is quite as blatant as a YouTube video or an ad on the television screen. We should be aware of it around us, and we should be aware of our leanings toward ethnocentrism. In fact, I'd like for you to check yourself right now. After watching that video, did you have particular thoughts about people who live in Alabama or people who are from Alabama? Before you make sweeping judgments about everyone who lives in Alabama, your instructor is from Alabama. Next, I'd like for us to think about ethnocentrism in a different way. Ethnocentrism can look like it did in this ad. It can also look like a complete unawareness of what's going on around a person. In this type of ethnocentrism, the person doesn't see any reason to learn about people from other cultures, other places, completely centered on that person's own culture and own place. In this type of ethnocentrism, the person misses out on even the most basic facts about people from other places and other cultures. The satire from Mean Girls does a wonderful job of poking fun at this type of ethnocentrism.
So if you're from Africa, why are you white?
Oh my God, Karen, you can't just ask people why they're white.
Could you give us some privacy for like 1 second?
What examples of stereotyping and ethnocentrism do you see here?
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no, where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah, Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well.
Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a small tea. Double, toil and trouble. Mind the gap! Beware Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio!
I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Although each of these videos was funny, ethnocentrism and stereotyping are not funny. Stereotyping is most often based on inaccurate and negative generalizations about a group, not coming from a place of inquiry and wanting to understand a culture. When groups of people engage in ethnocentric beliefs and actions and take on negative stereotypes, dangerous and awful things happen to groups of people who are not a member of this group. Next, I'd like for us to think about time. How do you manage your time? How is time typically managed within your major culture group? Take a look at this video for an understanding about time management around the world.
I guess we all believe that time is pretty constant. But around the world, attitudes to it differ greatly. While you can set your watch by Swiss trains, not all cultures break the day down into minutes and seconds. For other cultures, punctuality is a very different matter. A German sales executive trying to open doors in a number of African countries scheduled 2 meetings a day. For him, quite easy going. His first meeting didn't even take place till a day later. By the end of his trip, he was so stressed out he could hardly operate. He mistakenly thought his hosts would look at time like he did. In Africa, like in the Middle East or South America, there they work in blocks of time. Half a day maybe, certainly not in minutes. As long as they can achieve what they need in that block of time, then exactly when is less important. That's not to say that they're less efficient or effective, it's just that they work at their own pace. If you work in seconds, then you need to adapt, otherwise you're going to set yourself up for a lot of resistance from your hosts, and you're going to get constant disappointment. And then there are cultural anomalies. In French society, absolute punctuality is not the highest priority. But if you arrive late at a French restaurant, don't expect a warm welcome. The French take their food very seriously and consider lateness a sign of disrespect for their culinary efforts. You'd better pay some serious compliments to the waiters if you want to get back in their good books. The American expression, time is money, can be taken very literally in the US. A chatty bank teller whose line's moving slowly will cause customers to become impatient. And you'll also get an earful if the line has to wait because you haven't filled out your forms ahead of time. The subcontinent. Time can seem pretty cheap here. Everything else may be late, but as a visitor, your punctuality is expected. Patience is key. As with much of Asia, if you try to rush things, you'll risk offending your hosts. They're in control. They must not be seen to lose face through your impatience. But the ironic thing is, when you need something in a hurry, it can happen. Like a new suit. A guy I know was visiting India and he'd heard of the amazing speed and skill of the Mumbai tailors. His beautiful silk suit had received a gaping burn hole and he had to be at a reception the following afternoon. So he went to the local tailor and asked for an exact copy. The following morning he went back for it and sure enough, it was ready for him, exactly as he ordered it. Right down to the burn hole. So just because a culture doesn't measure itself in seconds doesn't mean they're inefficient. The next time you're in Switzerland, see how long it takes you to get a new suit made. Unless, of course, you can find an Indian tailor.
So how do we characterize these differences in approach to timekeeping across different cultures? A monochronic approach to timekeeping means that time is the focus. The precision on a beginning time and an ending time is important within monochronic cultures. People from monochronic cultures tend to take on one task at a time rather than multitasking. If you are working with someone who has a monochronic orientation to time and you are late, this is very rude. You'll be considered behaving very offensively to that person. The monochronic orientation to time sends the message that others should value my time. You're wasting my time if you're late. This is very typical in Western cultures and is different from a polychronic orientation to time. In a polychronic orientation to time, relationships are the focus rather than time. And rather than there being a specific beginning time and ending time, tasks occur often, many tasks at one time, and there's a flow between tasks that is not governed by strict time frame. Promptness is not a priority in a polychronic orientation to time, and so being late is common within this type of orientation. And a polychronic orientation is more common in Eastern cultures. But we don't have to visit different countries to see these differences. We see these differences within a country, within a single place. In fact, you may feel that you fit into one of these more strongly than the other, and it may be different than the culture that you're a part of, or the work group that you're a part of. And when your approach to time is different from those that are around you, then we can have some difficulties and some misinterpretations. So I'll give you a story of an example of when I experienced a different approach to timekeeping than I'd normally been exposed to. And I traveled to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, there is more of a polychronic approach to time. I did not know this. So I had traveled there to work with a group of early childhood educators on family-centered practices and routines-based interviewing, and the session was to start at 9 o'clock. Already I thought, this is kind of late. I'm used to sessions starting at 8, but that's fine. And the person who brought me was to pick me up at 8 o'clock. So 5 minutes to 8, I was downstairs in the hotel lobby, dressed, ready to go. 8 o'clock came and went, 8:15 came and went, 8:30 came and went, and I was beginning to get nervous. Where is this person? At about 15 to 9, the person picking me up arrived, completely calm, not apologetic for being late, just, we're headed to the session now. So we drive to the session, the location of the session, which interestingly was a casino. In that town, it was the location that had the best venue for a large group. And I got there at 15. We arrived close to 9 at the venue, and no one knew what room the session was to occur in. So we were wandering around, and I'm feeling very nervous, like we're supposed to be starting already. And all of the people that were there to attend, they were fine. They were hanging out, they were chatting. Some of them were doing some work together. And we searched for the room. About 15 after 9, we find the room. The projector didn't work. I'm getting really nervous now because people are coming into the room. They're expecting us to start, I thought. And the projector isn't working. So finally they find another projector. We get hooked up. It's 9:30, and the people who brought me said, and before we begin, we have a breakfast available for you. And so everyone funneled into the breakfast room, got their breakfast, and came back into the session very, very late. But nobody's nervous about it. Nobody's worried about it at all. Everyone's enjoying the time together. Everyone's talking about what we're going to be talking about at the session and having a good time. Then when it's time to conclude that afternoon, about 4 o'clock, I'm thinking, should I hurry? Should I cut some of the session out? But I realize everyone is completely engaged. They're completely involved and asking great questions and having great conversations. And no one is anxious for me to conclude at 4 o'clock. And so fortunately, I took those signals to mean that I should continue and should continue to facilitate conversation. And it's true, after reading about monochronic versus polychronic orientations to time, I realized if I had cut the session off promptly at 4 and said time to go, I would have been signaling to the group that my time is more valuable than what's happening here. And so having an understanding of your own orientation to time and the orientation of time of groups that you're working in, people that you're working with, can be helpful to you as you interpret signals and plan for interactions. Next, I'd like for us to think about displays of emotion. Are you someone who shows your emotion verbally, non-verbally? Do you show your emotion on your face and with your body language? Or are you someone who is more reserved in showing emotion, who has more of a poker face? Let's think about this notion of emotion as a dimension of culture.
If there is conflict at work, how do you demonstrate your emotion? When you are angry, thrilled, or otherwise feel strongly about an issue, do you heat up or do you cool down? This demonstrative spectrum runs from hot to cold, from very loud to very soft, from very verbal to very restrained. Some cultures favor an open show of emotions by shouting, crying, using broad, gesturing body language, flowery and poetic language, or swearing and cursing. You express your passion and your integrity and your commitment to an issue or person by how vividly you display those emotions. Your animation is proof of your veracity and your commitment. On the other hand, some cultures prefer a low-key, rational approach to emotion and conflict, an even and quiet tone of voice, minimal body language, a reduced display of emotion to show maturity and thoughtfulness and to avoid disruption. If your style is to heat up, you will find your cooler counterpart downright cold. Does he not care about this issue or working it out? I can't believe he just walked away from me. Or, if you are the cool cucumber using your inside voice and doing your best to reduce tension, your passionately arguing and gesturing coworker most likely feels to you out of control. Indeed, you may well think he is simply having a tantrum. You much prefer to leave it for another day, you tell him, saying, when we can both act like adults. The inevitable result, if you don't recognize these different styles? Friction at best, frustration and fury, internal or external, depending, of course, on your style, animated or rational.
Knowing where you stand on this spectrum of emotion can be helpful as you plan to interact with families. I know that growing up in the Deep South, there was an expectation of my culture, of the larger group that I was a part of, that women are to be more neutral in their emotions. They're not to show a lot of emotion verbally or non-verbally and be more reserved. And that's not at all how I am. And so for the longest time I felt like this was a flaw. But now I understand that I'm just more emotive. I show more emotion and that's okay. What's important is that I do pay attention to the culture of different groups that I'm a part of or interacting with so that I can be a more effective communicator by being responsive to the type of communication and emotional expression that is expected within that group. Next, I'd like for us to think about the notion of status as a dimension of culture.
To whom do we offer respect? In some cultures, your status is based on your individual achievements. In the United States, for example, we love a rags to riches story. During Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008, one of the most compelling parts of his narrative described how he had been abandoned by his father, brought up by a poor single mom, studied hard, attended and then excelled at Harvard Law School. He did it on his own. When Grace, a college graduate, was job-seeking, her father offered to make some phone calls on her behalf. "No way, Dad," she said. "I want to do this on my own." She felt she would gain greater respect if she did it all by herself. Achieved status explains why we often look up to great athletes but feel so deeply betrayed when we discover they used performance-enhancing drugs. In contrast, ascribed status is based on the family you were born into, or the social or political or economic position or group you are in, not what you have personally accomplished. If you grew up in or work in a culture which recognizes ascribed status, then you may automatically defer to a member of the nobility, say the emperor in Japan, or Queen Elizabeth of the United Kingdom, or a judge, a religious leader, even a professor or doctor. When I asked a Venezuelan colleague to recommend a babysitter for my daughter, she referred me to a young woman with no babysitting experience, she said, but she comes from an excellent family. One way of identifying which end of the spectrum you fall on, which value you hold, ascribed or achieved status, is to identify your heroes. Do you admire an athlete, or do you admire and respect a religious figure? Do you respect your boss because she is the boss? Ascribed or achieved? Our expectations with respect to respect deeply affect how we navigate relationships at work and how we ourselves expect to be treated. Ascribed or achieved?
Serving families in a family-centered manner can be challenging when the family has a status orientation. That is, in a family-centered practice, we're wanting to lean on the family's expertise, the family's priorities and concerns. And oftentimes professionals can get very frustrated when a family, upon being asked about their priorities and concerns, says, I don't know, you're the expert. You tell me what I should be wanting, what my priorities should be. And this can leave many providers frustrated, many educators wondering why the family is not engaging in the conversation in a family-centered way. But this notion of leaning towards status can help explain this. Methods like the routines-based interview can help bridge this gap when we're trying to ascertain a family's priorities and strengths. Next, I'd like for us to think about this notion of we versus I.
Individualism or collectivism? Do you define yourself as an I or a we? In considering cultural dimensions or attributes, individualism, the I, is a preference for independence and self-reliance. As an individual, you are expected to take care of yourself and your immediate family, but you have no obligations to a larger community. Cultures which focus on individualism celebrate the accomplishments of a person rather than a group. For example, does your employer single out an employee of the month? Employees from that background, the I background, might more naturally seek to advance their own interests within the job rather than that of the entire organization. Australia, the US, the UK are all individualist cultures emphasizing the obligations of the individual's human rights, the individual's personal responsibilities. Are you familiar with the saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease? This comes from cultures focusing on that individual. By contrast, other cultures on the other end of the spectrum, such as China or Pakistan or Venezuela or Ghana, the group is of paramount importance. This is collectivism. An individual is expected to be loyal to that group and not advance his or her own personal interests at the expense of the group. To operate outside the interests of the group is considered downright shameful, both to the individual and that group, whether family or work-based. In fact, in Japan, a collectivist culture, unlike the squeaky wheel, the nail that sticks up will be hammered down. In a workplace favoring collectivism, relationships at work are considered to be family-like. The employer offers protection in exchange for loyalty. An employee with poor skills would not be dismissed, but probably moved to another position. On the other end of the spectrum, employers and employees favoring individualism see the work relationship strictly as business, An employer reasonably may terminate an employee for poor performance, and a successful employee will frankly consider accepting a better pay offer from a competitor. These contrasting values can seriously impair communication and expectations at work. So which are you? Are you an I or are you a we?
This cultural dimension of individualism or collectivism can appear in our work with families. Some families highly value the independence of their children. They may focus on developmental milestones and wanting to make sure that their child is independent in all of his or her activities. We may see a family focus heavily on wanting their child to be the best. They're very interested in how their child is performing relative to other students. In a collectivist culture, however, there's much more of a focus on how the group is performing, wanting to make sure that my child is contributing and a part of the group, and that the group is doing well and succeeding. In cultures that focus more on collectivism than individualism, there may be less of a focus on independence. I remember some years ago, there was a family at a local child care center who came in each day at lunchtime to feed their child. Now you may say that's nice, the family would come in to feed their infant, the mom would come in to feed their infant every day, but this was not an infant. This child was a preschooler. And I can remember the staff at the preschool thinking this was just crazy. Why wouldn't the parent allow the child to feed herself? She was old enough, she could learn to feed herself. It would have been helpful if the staff at the preschool had understood that they were approaching this from an individualistic perspective, and the family's culture was collectivist. In this family's culture, I'm a good mom if I feed my child. In Ethiopia, for example, families may feed their children by hand until their child is 10 or 12, which, if you are from an individualistic perspective in terms of feeding, then you may see this as very strange. But it is important that regardless of our own perspectives, that we honor and value those perspectives of families. Family gets to choose this for themselves. A family gets to decide whether to value independence or interdependence. Next, I'd like for us to turn to the notion of high context versus low context cultures.
One skill that I think is really important for all people, everybody that comes to Thunderbird, if they don't leave Thunderbird learning this skill, I think they've missed something. Any executive coming to Thunderbird for a corporate learning program that doesn't, at least is not aware of what the skill is, I think is missing something. And it's a very, very simple skill. And it's, in my opinion, the best contribution of social psychology to business. And it relates to language. And it relates to communication. And it's not learning another language, but it's being aware that some cultures, some languages, are what we refer to as low context. And the idea was coined by an anthropologist, an American anthropologist, Edward Hall, in his book written in the 50s called The Silent Language. And there he talked about languages and cultures that are low context are taught and learn to say what they mean. So if you want to know what an American really means, or what a German means, or what a Scandinavian means, and these are low context languages, the best way to figure it out, the best way to start, is to look at what did they say, because they are taught to say what they mean. But other languages, other cultures, Japanese, Chinese, Thai, Korean, to a lesser Arabic, to a lesser extent French, Portuguese, Italian, etc., Spanish. They're referred to as high context language. And what that means is they use many words, but the meaning is more subtle, it's more nuanced, it's more circular. So if you want to know what a Chinese really means, don't look only at the words. You have to look behind the words. You have to look at what is not said. And so one of the skills that I think we all need in today's world is the ability to recognize this concept and to be bilingual in it. In some instances, when I'm talking in business, I need to be direct, clear. In some instances, when I'm involved in global business, I need to be more high context, more indirect. When I'm building the team, when I'm learning about people. See, high context is more about listening and interpreting accurately. Low context is more about saying or sending out as opposed to hearing or receiving. And Americans are really, really good at being clear and at stating what we mean, dealing with conflict directly. Other people, Japanese, Chinese, are much more indirect. And what I have learned is this, and I can say it in about 2 sentences, based on 5 years of living in Japan and having traveled back to Asia 100+ times since I left. If I force a high context speaker, Japanese, to give me a yes or no answer, I will probably get a yes, I understand. Yes, I will do it. And learn nothing. If I nuance it a little and are more aware that they may not be so comfortable giving me an answer which they think I might disagree with or be contrary to in terms of my opinion, I might learn a lot more about them if I'm more subtle and nuanced as I communicate and solve problems with them.
Clearly, we can see that an understanding of high and low context language is necessary when working with families. We need to have both an understanding of our own orientation and be ready to look for clues of high or low context from the families we serve. High and low context behaviors have relevance in the classroom as well. Consider a teacher who has a low context and neutral emotion orientation. And in that teacher's class is a child whose culture is high context and animated emotion. Do you see how conflict might arise? Unless this teacher has an understanding of these dimensions of behavior, the child's behavior may be misinterpreted to be defiant, when in fact the child is behaving quite appropriately for his or her culture. This misinterpretation of the high context, high animation combination is one of the reasons that African American boys are over-referred for behavior disorder evaluation in the U.S. We have to listen for cues of the cultural context for families and students we serve. A sixth dimension of culture we need to understand is locus of control. In the module on poverty, we'll examine this dimension in depth. I look forward to your self-reflections and discussions on these 5 dimensions of culture.